What kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all.
Every woman in Wichita was scared to death.
Beginning in 1974, an anonymous serial killer who was initially known as BTK, which stood for Bind Them, Torture Them, Kill Them, went on a rampage in Wichita, Kansas, killing about 8 people, including 4 members of 15-year-old Charlie Otero family for 30 years. He wanted to be famous, so for the next 3 decades, he kept feeding the police with just enough evidence to get his glory while remaining anonymous. But for Charlie Otero, he had forgotten about what happened 30 years ago, and he wasn't about to forgive the man who murdered his parents and 2 of his siblings. This is the twisted case of Charlie Otero, Mr. Joseph Otero, Sr., and his wife, Julia Maria. Otero loved their 5 kids so much that they worked themselves off to provide for them. All they did was for their kids. They had a wonderful first child, 15-year-old Charlie Otero, whose greatest desire was to make them proud. Charlie was every parent's dream. Child, aside from being a great student, he always looked out for his younger ones. The family had just moved to Wichita, Kansas, and Charlie had to change schools. Still, with his attitude toward learning, Charlie had a bright future ahead of him, and his family didn't fail to show him the love and support that he needed. He cherished them so much with each of his siblings. Equally impressive. Charlie loved the way his parents cared for themselves. He even described their love as one anybody would pray to have. January 15, 1974, started like every other winter morning for the Otero household. It was snowing and Charlie had a test to write in school. He wanted to prepare a little bit more. So he asked his father, Joseph Sr., to drive him to school very early that day so he could go to the study hall. His father agreed, but couldn't get his other children, Danny and Carmen, to stay back. They also wanted to get to school that early, so they joined their dad, leaving their 2 youngest siblings, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr., at home with their mom. After dropping off the kids, Joseph Sr. returned home to his wife and 2 kids, only to be greeted by an ugly scene. The little boy, Joseph Jr., had gone to open the back door for their dog to come inside, but instead he met a young man standing there and staring at him. Before the little boy could say anything, the young man rushed at him, forcing his way into the house and confronting the whole family with a pistol. The man, who wasn't masked, told everyone that he was wanted in California and that he needed to eat and also take their car. The family's dog, sensing danger, couldn't keep it down as he kept barking at the strange man. The intruder felt troubled and asked Mr. Otero to take the dog outside. Mr. Otero then asked one of his kids to take the dog away. The family remained inside the living room, lying on the floor, when the intruder asked the 4 of them to stand up and go to the bathroom. On getting there, he kept threatening them with the gun as he went ahead to tie them up. With everyone tied up, Mr. Otero pleaded that the intruder could take their money and their car as he didn't want anyone to get hurt. But when the intruder remembered that he wasn't wearing a mask and that he still hadn't satisfied his sexual fantasies, he decided to kill the family. Apparently, he had been planning this for 2 months, ever since he saw Mrs. Julia Otero dropping her children off at school. He now had his chance. Besides, he had already cut the phone lines, so he had a lot of time. The intruder went to Mr. Joseph Otero, put a plastic bag over his head and tried to strangle him with a cord. But since this was going to be his first murder, he wasn't quite familiar with strangling, so he only managed to keep the pressure on until Mr. Joseph Sr. passed out. He then proceeded to Mrs. Julia Otero, who was screaming and begging. He did the same thing to her and she passed out. Then went to Josephine and strangled her until she passed out. He was about to do the same thing to Joseph Jr. when he discovered that Mr. Otero had bitten off a part of the bag and was still alive. He dumped what he was doing and used more clothes to wrap the head of Joseph Sr., putting an extra plastic bag on his head before strangling him one more time. This time he was sure that he was going to die. He then moved to Joseph Jr. and began strangling him, but was cut short by Mrs. Otero's scream. She had woken up and this only made the intruder mad. She begged the man to save her son, and when he removed the bag, Mrs. Otero prayed that God would forgive him for the evil he was doing to her family. These words seemed to have no effect on him as he went ahead to strangle her again with a plastic bag and a cord. When he confirmed that she was dead, he put a bag over Joseph Jr.'s head again and took him to his room, where he added more clothes to his head and strangled him to death. He then went back to the room and noticed that Josephine had woke him back up. So he took her to the basement and strangled her to death before tying her up to a pipe by her neck, and then sexually abused her lifeless body. Even ejaculating under her feet, he left her there and went to the other rooms to put things in order before driving the family's car to their close neighbor's house, where he dumped it and walked back to his car. Later that day, Charlie walked back home with his two siblings, with so much joy in his heart. He had crushed the test, and he couldn't wait to tell his family about it. But as he approached home, he sensed something was off when he saw the back door open in the dark outside. He then went through the kitchen door and noticed his mother's purse was on the stove, which was awkward. He yelled out, asking if anyone was home, but everywhere was quiet. The next thing he heard was the voice of a younger sibling who had walked home with him. His sibling called out loudly to him, telling him to rush over and that their parents were playing a bad trick on them. Charlie got there and saw his parents lying on the floor with their hands and feet restrained. He touched them and immediately knew they were dead. Charlie then asked his younger brother to call the police, but they found out that the phone line had been cut. So he took his siblings to a neighbor's house where they asked for the police to be called. The police got there and immediately took Charlie and his siblings to safety. He touched them and immediately knew they were dead. Charlie then asked his younger brother to call the police, but they found out that the phone line had been cut, so he took his siblings to a neighbor's house where they asked for the police to be called. The police got there and immediately took Charlie and his siblings to safety. But before they could do anything, Charlie asked the police to go to the schools of his two youngest siblings and stop them from coming back home so they wouldn't see the ugly scenes. He begged that his siblings be brought to him so he could watch them, but unknown to him, there was bad news. After police officers saw the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Otero, they searched the whole house and found Joseph Jr.'s body in his room, bound and with a bag over his head. They continued to search, and when they entered the basement, they saw Josephine hanging from a pipe with her hands and feet tied up. They also saw semen at her feet, and one of the officers made a move that would eventually be of great help in the future. He took a pillowcase and cut it into different pieces. He then used the pieces to soak up the semen. In 1974, no one knew what DNA was, but the officers knew it would aid them in one way or another. The police officers broke the bad news to Charlie, and when he found out Joseph Jr. and Josephine had been killed alongside his parents, he lost all hope and decided to go the wrong way. 1 month later, Charlie and his remaining siblings, Carmen and Danny, were sent to live with their uncle in New Mexico in hopes that they could have a fresh start. In 1974, no one knew what DNA was, but the officers knew it would aid them in one way or another. The police officers broke the bad news to Charlie, and when he found out Joseph Jr. and Josephine had been killed alongside his parents, he lost all hope and decided to go the wrong way. 1 month later, Charlie and his remaining siblings, Carmen and Danny, were sent to live with their uncle in New Mexico in hopes that they could have a fresh start. On April 4th, 1974, another crime occurred. 19-year-old Kevin Bright was seen close to his house, just 2 miles away from where the Otero family lived. He was badly injured and was begging for help, telling passers-by to help him call the police. He said he and his sister were attacked by a strange man and his sister was still in the house. After calling the police, they arrived at the house where they saw 21-year-old Catherine Bright lying on the bed, restrained by nylon stockings and stabbed in the back and abdomen. She was in severe pain and unfortunately died on the way to the hospital. Her brother, however, managed to survive the 2 shots to his head and helped the police draw up a sketch of the murderer. After searching Kevin's home, they found some similarities and a few differences between the murder of the Oteros and that of Catherine Bryant. While the others were strangled, Catherine was stabbed and Kevin shot. But the phone lines were cut before the attack, just like in the case of the Oteros. The police didn't want to believe that a serial killer was on the loose, but they hoped they could apprehend whoever had done it. A sketch of the killer that Kevin helped the police with was published in news outlets as fear spread throughout the city. Although everyone tried to be on the lookout, No major leads were obtained. The entire neighborhood lived in constant fear, wondering who the next victim would be. Ultimately, 6 months later, a young man confessed to killing the Oteros with the help of his 2 friends. To the police, the case had been solved, and normalcy returned to the entire city. But sadly, the joy was short-lived as a news reporter received a call that would change everything. The anonymous person told the reporter to get to the library and take a letter from an engineering book. At the beginning of the letter, the author confessed to carrying out his activities by himself and alone. He then went on to share details about the crime scene that only someone who had been there would know. It turns out the killer was jealous that a random person was stealing his spotlight and decided to take it back. He wrote without remorse details of the positions he left each victim in and even promised to continue killing. At the end of the letter, he said his code name would be BTK, which stood for Bind Them, Torture Them, and Kill Them. It was frustrating for the police, as the author of the letter could not be tracked, but it was even more frustrating when for years no one heard from him again. He remained silent for the whole of 1975 and 1976, traumatizing the residents of Wichita, Kansas, as they knew that a serial killer was among them and he could strike at any moment. Charlie, who was 800 miles away, didn't know about the happenings in Wichita. The kid, who was once the perfect example, continued in his bad acts, but managed to graduate from high school in 1977. After his graduation, he turned to the streets and became a drifter. He also went into drugs and stole food. Charlie was now a shadow of himself. Back in Wichita, BTK struck again. On March 17, 1977, 5-year-old Steve was sent to go get a can of soup for his sick 25-year-old single mother of 3 on his way back. The little boy met a young man who showed him a picture of a woman and a child and asked if he knew who that person was. When the child said he did it, the stranger allowed him to go, but made sure to know the particular residence he went to. 15 minutes later, he showed up at the little boy's home, claiming to be a private detective before forcefully entering the house with a .357 Magnum pistol out of fear. 6 Shirley Ruth Vienne taught her kids to do as the man said. The intruder went on to tell Shirley that he struggles with sexual fantasies and that he would have to lock her kids up, held at gunpoint. Shirley agreed to help the stranger carry out his plans. The man locked the 3 kids in the bathroom, where he kept blankets and toys but tied them up. He then proceeded to tie Shirley's legs together to her bedpost, and just then she vomited. This made the intruder very angry, as he wanted to satisfy his fantasies. But with the way the kids kept screaming and banging on the door, the telephone ringing, and Shirley's vomit, the intruder, who was later discovered to be BTK, decided to make it quick. He put a plastic bag over Shirley's head and tied it up with the remaining rope he tied her legs with. He then strangled her to death and wanted to do the same to her kids, but luckily they had escaped through the bathroom window. BTK knew he had to be extra fast, so he quickly arranged his stuff and made for his car, which was parked close to the residence. 5-year-old Steve had run over to a neighbor's house where he explained everything, and immediately the police showed up. But it was too late. They only met a dead woman. No one knew exactly what was going on. But 7 months later, tragedy struck again. BTK was now a serial killer. As he promised, he enjoyed what he was doing. So when he noticed 25-year-old Nancy Jo Fox going into her home in Wichita, he marked her as a potential victim and began stalking her. On December 9, 1977, BTK knocked at her door, and when nobody answered, he cut the phone lines before breaking in to wait for Nancy in her kitchen. When she entered, he confronted her and forced her to be calm. And when she was, he told her that he was the one responsible for the murders that were happening in the city. He then strangled her to death on her bed with his belt. The following day, BTK called the police from a phone booth, giving them details of the address where they would find Nancy's body.
Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
After each murder, the police always had a lead, but they always went cold. They were left confused. But the next year, they got yet another letter. In early 1978, BTK sent another letter to the television station Kiki in Wichita, claiming responsibility for the murders of not only the Crows, but also Catherine Bright, Shirley, and Nancy Fox. He demanded media attention in this letter, asking, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" He wanted to be anonymously famous so bad, so he continued on his killing spree. On April 27, 1985, BTK kidnapped 53-year-old Maureen Hedge and strangled her to death. He took her dead body to Christ Lutheran Church, where he held a very reputable position. He then photographed her lifeless body in various bondage positions before dumping her body in a remote ditch. She was found on May 5, 1985, by the police, now addicted to the killings. He kept on searching for his next victim, and sadly, he found one on September 16, 1986. BTK entered the residence of 28-year-old Vicki Lynn Webb girl, pretending to be a telephone repairman. He then strangled her to death with a nylon stocking before rearranging her clothes post-mortem and taking photographs of her nude body with an insane serial killer roaming free on the streets. Nowhere was safe. Everyone was terrified. Coincidentally, the murders always happened close to each other. It was as though the area was the killer's playground, and even when he went quiet for some years and decided to strike again, it was around the same area. On January 19, 1991, he strangled 62-year-old Dolores Airline D. Davis with a pantyhose. She was found on February 1, 1991 at West 117th Street, North in North Meridian Street in Park City, Kansas. After this murder, BTK kept quiet for 13 years, with no new murders or communications. The city went still. Some even believed BTK had died or moved away. It was 2004 and Charlie Otero wasn't getting better. He was grown now and even had a son whom he named after his father and brother Joseph. It was clear that he had grown to be a troubled man. He was completing his time in prison for domestic violence, and every time his 16-year-old child visited, it broke his heart that he wasn't living up to the dream his late parents had for him. He was filled with anger. He wanted revenge, and to an extent, he got it. In January 2004, someone started writing a book on the BTK case, and he was getting publicity for it. This was something BTK couldn't handle. He wanted to be in the spotlight, not someone else. He hated that someone was getting all the credit for his work. So on March 19, 2004, he broke his silence. He sent a letter to the Wichita Police Department which contained the photos he took of Vicki Lynn and also her ID card, which was never found by the police during the investigations. He wanted to prove that he was the one who committed the crime. Over the next months, he maintained steady streams of communication with the news media, using letters and puzzles that contained plastic dolls in bondage, identical to the bondage of the victims in the past. BTK was enjoying every bit of what was going on, so he didn't realize his folly in time. The police knew that if they could keep communicating with BTK, he would make a mistake. So they started doing what he wanted. They frequently kept going to the news, sharing facts about the case, calling his name and appealing to his ego. Their plan seemed to work. As for March 2004 to January 2005, the Wichita Police Department received a total of 5 communication letters from the serial killer. They tried to bond with him so he could feel comfortable enough until he made a mistake, and luckily he did. On January 25, 2005, the latest letter was found in a cereal box left at a Home Depot parking lot. And in the letter, he said he wanted to change his mode of communication and asked if the police could trace a floppy disk. He wanted them to be honest, but they knew he had to be caught. So they replied to him, saying they could not. And that was when he made the mistake they had been waiting for. It was 2004. The surveillance cameras that weren't available 30 years ago now came in. After a check, they found a picture of a man called Dennis Rader, who was the president of his church, a compliance officer of the city of Park City, and an employee at ADT, the alarm company. Immediately, the police drove out to Park City in a black Jeep Cherokee was found in the driveway. They then put 24-hour surveillance on Dennis Rader while they built the case around him. Dennis Rader had a daughter who went to Kansas State University and had just had a Pap smear test. The police obtained a warrant for a sample from the test and tried to match it with a semen sample the officer took under Josephine. DNA tests showed a familial match between the Pap smear and the semen. This indicated that the killer was closely related to Rader's daughter. Combined with the other evidence, it was enough for the police to arrest Rader on February 25, 2005. Police arrested Dennis Rader while he was driving near his home in Park City shortly after noon when he was brought into custody. He was shown the floppy disk and asked if he knew what it was. Dennis Rader then poked the floppy disk and asked his question in reply, "Why did you lie to me?" And that was when it was confirmed that BTK was in fact Dennis Rader.
Anyway, you can get out the DNA, right?
You can't get out your DNA unless you've had a total blood transfer and lost every organ. It's there.
I need to ask.
Sure.
You like it? How do you like it?
Because I was trying to catch you.
When Charlie got the news of the arrest he'd been waiting for 30 years, his anger grew even more. He planned to get his hands on Dennis Rader, the monster that killed his parents, his 2 younger siblings, and his dream. On June 27, 2005, just after Dennis had pleaded guilty, his trial began with every surviving member of each victim's family present. They all watched in silence as the killer spent 45 minutes describing what he had done to each of his victims. While at it, he showed no remorse of any kind. The first break was over, and Charlie thought he had his chance to carry out his plan. But just then, he received a call that would change everything. His son Joseph had just gotten into a car accident, and all Charlie could think about was the survival of his son. He immediately changed his mind towards Dennis and prayed that nothing wrong had happened to his child. He gave his statement in court and dropped every ounce of anger he felt towards Dennis. Charlie would have ended up in prison, but somehow he had escaped. After 45 minutes, Dennis Rader was given 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. Kansas didn't have the death penalty at the time of the murders, so Joseph escaped the painful death he caused his victims. The arrest of the notorious serial killer may have brought relief to so many, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of people lost their lives and some were damaged mentally. We do hope that all the survivors find a way to heal. Thank you for watching to the end. Kindly like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. See you in our next video. Bye.